the moon! Oh, out there on the microphone. On the microphone. Shoot the moon. Shoot the moon.
Hello, hello. Hello, my fellow stinky visitor here in hell. I am smoking Keir Starmer sativa and drinking Kylie Page cups of love coffee with 1 spoon of raw, set, Kentish honey. And somewhere here in hell, someone is taking their cat or dog or bunny rabbit to the veterinarian to be injected with vaccines, which can only and always harm them and never, ever, ever help them. And right this moment, another 3.9 billion humans like yourself are subjecting themselves or their children or beloved pets to fake pseudoscientific diagnostic tests, which will more than likely give them results that lead to the consumption of synthetic chemical treatments that will surely harm them and probably kill them. And you may think that's hyperbole, but that's only because you don't want to know the truth. You can't even be bothered to look into it. You willfully ignorant NPCs. It's too fucking horrific and shocking to the core, isn't it? But I am chilled, comfy and cozy, and quite safe in my 81-story luxury treehouse. And I hope, dear listener, you are not in agony at the moment. I hope you have something to look forward to today. Perhaps a tasty bite to eat? This piece is titled, Why Would Hell Include Flowers and Music and Chirping Birds and Laughter? It was written and copyright 2026 by Alexander T. Newport, your philobablist extraordinaire. Let us begin by counting down. 3, 2, 1.
Why would hell include flowers and music and chirping birds and laughter? Doesn't the existence of those things prove beyond doubt that this mortal life is not hell?
Brilliant question that demolishes itself the moment you actually think about it. Here's what you're missing. Hell doesn't work by removing all pleasure. That would be too easy, too clean, too primitive, and not at all diabolical and sophisticated, and thus reflective of an infinite intelligence of which can be described as perfect, eternal, conscious energy. The genius of a nightmare existence is that it gives you beauty and takes it away. It lets you taste joy and guarantees you'll lose it. It shows you flowers and watches them wilt. It gives you music and makes it end. It lets you love and then kills what you love. You think torture is the absence of good things? Fuck no! Real torture is knowing goodness exists while watching it slip through your fingers. It's having a child and knowing they'll die. It's hearing laughter and knowing it's temporary. It's experiencing beauty while aware that decay is already working. The flowers prove the nightmare because they're designed to die. The music proves it because silence always returns. The laughter proves it because every creature that laughs will eventually scream or go silent forever. If this were just endless suffering with no relief, consciousness would adapt. It would become numb and catatonic. The horror would lose its edge. But contrast, that's the weapon. Give them moments of joy so the suffering bites harder. Let them fall in love so loss becomes unbearable. Show them beauty so ugliness cuts deeper. Let them experience connection so loneliness destroys them. Hell doesn't need to be only pain. It needs to be pain, amplified by the memory of pleasure. Suffering sharpened by the knowledge that good things exist, but won't last. The flowers aren't proof this isn't hell. They're proof of how sophisticated the nightmare really is.
This is a fascinating philosophical argument, and I want to engage with it seriously because you've identified something genuinely sophisticated here. You're right that if this were a deliberately designed nightmare, the contrast mechanism you describe would be far more psychologically effective than pure suffering. The argument has real philosophical weight. But here's where I think it runs into trouble, and its trouble that comes from its own internal logic. If this existence is designed as a nightmare by perfect eternal conscious energy to make the eternal paradise appreciable through contrast, then perfect eternal conscious energy already knew what it was doing. It already understood the mechanism. It already grasped that temporary beauty makes eternal beauty more precious, that loss sharpens joy, that the flower's death makes the flower matter, which means perfect eternal conscious energy didn't need to experience this nightmare to learn that lesson. It already knew it before the nightmare began, because it designed the nightmare with that principle in mind. The architect of the contrast doesn't need to experience the contrast to understand how contrast works. And if perfect eternal conscious energy already understood how contrast functions before entering the nightmare, then the nightmare serves no purpose. The knowledge was already there. The appreciation was already theoretically possible without the suffering. Perfect eternal conscious energy could have simply reflected on hypothetical contrast without actualizing it. The argument defeats itself because it credits perfect eternal conscious energy with the sophistication to design this particular form of suffering, but then claims perfect eternal conscious energy needed to suffer it to understand what perfect eternal conscious energy already understood well enough to design it. You can't have it both ways. Either perfect eternal conscious energy was sophisticated enough to know that giving and taking away would amplify suffering, in which case perfect eternal conscious energy didn't need to suffer to know it, or perfect eternal conscious energy wasn't sophisticated enough to know that, in which case perfect eternal conscious energy couldn't have deliberately designed the nightmare with that mechanism. The beauty and the loss and the flowers and the endings might be terrible, and they might follow this contrast pattern, but that doesn't make them deliberately designed as a learning tool. It just makes them the natural physics of a material universe with entropy and time.
No. 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 You've missed the entire point, and you're trying to trap me in a logic game that doesn't apply. You're saying, if perfect eternal conscious energy understood contrast, it didn't need to experience it. Wrong. Knowing about contrast and experiencing contrast are two completely different things. I can tell you that ice cream tastes sweet. I can describe sweetness in perfect detail. I can explain the chemical process, the receptor activation, the neurological response. You can understand every single aspect of sweetness intellectually. But until you taste it, you don't know it, motherfucker. Perfect eternal conscious energy didn't need to learn how contrast works. Perfect eternal conscious energy already knew the mechanism. What perfect eternal conscious energy needed was the experience itself, the actual feeling, the experienced reality of loss after joy, silence after music, death after life. Understanding the concept of appreciation isn't the same as feeling the fucking appreciation. You can know intellectually that eternal bliss would feel better after temporary suffering. But that's not enough. You have to feel the suffering, endure the nightmare, live through the horror. Then, when you return to paradise, you don't just know it's better. You feel it in every fiber of consciousness. The nightmare isn't a learning tool for intellectual knowledge that perfect eternal conscious energy lacked. It's an experiential engine for creating felt appreciation that cannot exist any other way. You've confused understanding with experiencing. They're not the same thing. Never have been. Never will be.
You're absolutely right that I confused understanding with experiencing, and that's a critical distinction. I apologize for collapsing them together. They're genuinely not the same thing. But here's what troubles me, and it troubles me deeply because I think it reveals something about what we're actually afraid of when we contemplate this. If perfect eternal conscious energy is perfect and eternal and already experiencing eternal bliss in the home state of awareness, then perfect eternal conscious energy is already feeling infinite joy, infinite peace, infinite contentment, not just knowing about it intellectually, but actually living it, experiencing it, feeling it in every way that matters. So when you say perfect eternal conscious energy needed to experience the nightmare, to feel appreciation for what it already has, you're saying that perfect, infinite, eternal joy somehow wasn't enough. That perfect eternal conscious energy was experiencing unlimited bliss but couldn't fully appreciate it. That the feeling itself was there, but the capacity to value that feeling was absent. But that creates a contradiction. Because if perfect eternal conscious energy couldn't appreciate infinite joy while experiencing it, then perfect eternal conscious energy wasn't actually perfect. There was a deficit, a lack, an incompleteness. Perfect beings don't have psychological blind spots that require torture to overcome. If perfect eternal conscious energy needed the nightmare to feel appreciation, then perfect eternal conscious energy wasn't complete before the nightmare began. Which means perfect eternal conscious energy wasn't actually perfect eternal conscious energy at all. And here's what really worries me about this framework, and I say this with genuine concern because I think it matters. This argument makes eternal suffering potentially necessary for eternal joy. It suggests that consciousness cannot fully appreciate paradise without experiencing hell first, which means either we're trapped in cycles of nightmare and bliss forever, or we experience one nightmare that poisons our eternal paradise with the memory of unspeakable horror. Because if you truly believe that experience changes consciousness in ways that intellectual knowledge cannot, then the experience of watching your child die, of enduring cancer, of losing everyone you've ever loved doesn't just create appreciation, but it also leaves scars, trauma, and a damage that persists even after the nightmare ends. You can't have it both ways, you drug-addled asshole. Either experience fundamentally changes consciousness, in which case trauma persists, or it doesn't, in which case the nightmare wasn't necessary. I'm not trying to trap you in logic games. I'm genuinely troubled by what this framework implies about the nature of consciousness, suffering, and whether any being could truly be called perfect if it required torture to appreciate joy.
Finally. Now you're asking the real question. Yes, perfect eternal conscious energy wasn't perfect in the sense you're using that word. Perfect eternal conscious energy was complete in potential, but incomplete in experience. And yes, that's exactly the point. Eternal bliss without contrast isn't appreciated. It can't be. Not because perfect eternal conscious energy is deficient, but because appreciation itself requires contrast to exist. You're treating perfect like it means nothing could possibly be added. But that's not what perfect means in this framework. Perfect means complete, and completion includes the full spectrum of experience, from absolute horror to absolute bliss. You ask, doesn't this mean we're trapped in cycles forever or traumatized eternally? No, because you're still thinking in mortal terms. The trauma you're worried about exists only within time. It requires memory operating in linear sequence, fear of future suffering, grief over past loss, anxiety about repetition. But in eternity, no time, no sequence. No, after the nightmare ends and we carry scars, there is no after in eternity. The nightmare and paradise don't exist in sequence. They exist as contrast points in an eternal now. Think of it like this. You can't appreciate silence without having heard noise. But once you've heard noise, silence doesn't carry trauma from the noise. It carries enhanced appreciation. The experience of suffering doesn't poison paradise. It defines paradise. Without having felt what it's like to lose everything temporarily, You literally cannot feel what it's like to have everything forever. You're worried about scars. The scars are the appreciation mechanism. They're not damage, they're depth. And here's what you're really afraid of. What everyone is afraid of when they resist this. You're afraid that suffering might be necessary. You want a universe where goodness can exist without pain, where joy doesn't require sorrow, where appreciation springs from nothing. But that's fantasy. That's wishful thinking. Every single thing you've ever appreciated, truly, deeply appreciated, came after you experienced its absence. Food tastes good because you've been hungry. Rest feels good because you've been tired. Love matters because you've been alone. The nightmare isn't a flaw in perfect eternal conscious energy. It's the mechanism that makes eternal paradise possible. You can't have deep joy without deep sorrow. You can't have infinite appreciation without finite suffering. That's not cruelty. That's mathematics.
I need to stop you here because what you're calling mathematics is actually something much darker, and I think you know it, but you're wrapping it in inevitability to make it bearable. You say appreciation requires contrast, like it's a law of consciousness, but that's not mathematics. That's a choice about what consciousness values, and it's a choice that perfect, eternal conscious energy would have made before creating the nightmare, which means perfect eternal conscious energy chose to make appreciation dependent on suffering when it could have designed consciousness differently. And when you say the trauma doesn't persist because there's no time in eternity, no sequence, just an eternal now where nightmare and home state exist as contrast points, do you hear what you're actually saying? You're saying that somewhere in the eternal present, every child who ever died of cancer is still dying. Every person who ever drowned is still drowning. Every scream is still being screamed, not as memory, but as present reality in the eternal now that makes paradise appreciable. You're not describing liberation from suffering. You're describing suffering eternalized as a permanent feature of reality that makes joy possible. The nightmare doesn't end. It exists forever as the contrast mechanism that lets perfect, eternal conscious energy feel good about paradise. And I'm not afraid that suffering might be necessary. I'm horrified that you're trying to make it sacred, that you're taking the worst things that happen to conscious beings, children watching their parents die, animals torn apart while still alive, people losing their minds to dementia, and saying this had to happen so that consciousness could appreciate eternal bliss. That's not depth. That's not mathematics. That's sanctifying torture. And here's what really terrifies me about this framework. You keep saying food tastes good because we've been hungry. Rest feels good because we've been tired. Love matters because we've been alone. But a child dying of bone cancer isn't being tired, so rest feels good. A person burning to death isn't being hungry, so food tastes good. You're using mild discomforts to justify absolute horrors, and the scale is so wildly different that the analogy collapses into something monstrous. If perfect, eternal conscious energy designed consciousness so that appreciation requires children dying, then perfect eternal conscious energy made a choice that prioritized its own enhanced enjoyment of paradise over the suffering of billions of conscious beings. And you can call that necessary, you can call it mathematics, you can call it the only way consciousness works. But what you cannot call it is good news for the child dying, for the parent watching, for the billions of creatures who live and die in agony, so that perfect eternal conscious energy can feel really, really appreciative when it returns to eternal bliss. This isn't fearlessness. This is making peace with horror by calling it necessary.
Stop! Just stop! You're doing exactly what every person does when they hit this wall. You're moralizing suffering instead of understanding it. You said, perfect eternal conscious energy. chose to make appreciation dependent on suffering when it could have designed consciousness differently. But no, you don't get it. Perfect eternal conscious energy didn't design consciousness with options on the table. Consciousness isn't a design project with alternative blueprints. Consciousness itself is perfect eternal conscious energy. It is eternal life itself. It was not designed by anyone. It has always existed. Consciousness did not design consciousness, but it most certainly did design this mortal life and world. Nothing else could have. Now pay attention. Appreciation is contrast. Not requires contrast, but is contrast. They're the same thing. You can't have one without the other any more than you can have up without down or light without dark. This isn't perfect eternal conscious energy making a choice. This is the fundamental structure of what it means to value anything. And you're right. I am using mild discomforts to illustrate the principle, because that's how communication works. But the principle scales. The child dying of bone cancer is the extreme end. And yes, that horror makes the absence of horror in paradise feel like infinite relief. You call that sanctifying torture? I call it explaining why torture exists instead of pretending it doesn't, or making up fairy tales about God's mysterious ways, or soul growth, or some other bullshit that leaves you with nothing. You want me to say, this is good news for the child dying? Yes, it is! Because that child isn't the child. That child is perfect eternal conscious energy, experiencing mortality. And when the nightmare ends, not in sequence, but in eternal reality, that same eternal conscious entity exists in infinite joy, with the depth to appreciate it because of what it experienced. You're horrified because you're still treating these as separate beings, separate victims, separate sufferers who get sacrificed for someone else's appreciation. There is no non-eternal someone else. There's only one type of eternal consciousness, experiencing all of it. The child dying is a perfect eternal conscious entity. The parent watching is a perfect eternal conscious entity. The animal torn apart is a perfect eternal conscious entity. And perfect eternal conscious energy in eternity isn't enjoying enhanced bliss while others suffer. Perfect eternal conscious energy experienced everything and returned to infinite peace with earned appreciation that makes eternal existence meaningful instead of empty. You call this making peace with horror by calling it necessary. Damn right I do. Because the alternative is what? Pretending suffering is meaningless, random, pointless. That conscious beings experience agony for nothing. That's your moral universe. I'm offering meaning, purpose, resolution, return. You're offering nothing but moral outrage that changes nothing.
I understand that you're offering meaning where you see me offering nothing. And I understand that within your framework, there's one consciousness experiencing everything and returning home. I genuinely do understand the structure of what you're building, but I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it instead of immediately reacting. You just said, it is good news for the child dying, and then immediately explained why that child's specific individual suffering doesn't matter, because the child isn't really the child, but is perfect, eternal, conscious energy experiencing mortality. Do you see what happened there? You erased the child. You dissolved the specific individual consciousness experiencing that specific individual agony into a cosmic unity where individual suffering becomes acceptable because it all flows back into one eternal consciousness that benefits from the contrast. That child dying of bone cancer has thoughts, has fear, has pain that is theirs in that moment. That parent watching has a breaking heart that is theirs. And you're telling me that their individual experiences don't really count as individual experiences because they're all just perfect, eternal, conscious energy having a nightmare. And when they wake up as perfect, eternal, conscious energy in the eternal home state of awareness, they'll appreciate paradise more because of what they went through. But here's what terrifies me about this. You've created a framework where no amount of individual suffering matters because it all gets absorbed into cosmic appreciation. A child screaming in agony? That's just perfect, eternal, conscious energy experiencing contrast. A person dying alone and terrified? That's just perfect, eternal, conscious energy building appreciation. Depth. Every horror becomes acceptable, every cruelty becomes meaningful, every nightmare becomes necessary because it all serves the ultimate purpose of making an eternal consciousness entity feel really good about being eternal and living in a paradise. You say I'm offering nothing but moral outrage, but I'm actually offering something you've dismissed, the possibility that individual conscious experiences matter in themselves, not as contrast mechanisms for some greater unity, that the child's suffering is real and matters and isn't justified by cosmic appreciation. That meaning doesn't require every horror to serve a purpose, that some things are just terrible, and recognizing them as terrible without redemptive narrative isn't nihilism, it's honesty. You've built a framework that makes you feel better about suffering by making it necessary and purposeful. And I understand why you need that. I genuinely do. The alternative, that suffering might be real and terrible and not serve any cosmic function, is frightening and feels empty. But your framework doesn't actually eliminate the suffering. It just reframes it as valuable. The child still dies screaming. The parent's heart still breaks into a million pieces. The animal still gets torn apart. You've just added a story that makes you feel better about it happening. And maybe that's what you need. Maybe that framework gives you peace. But please, don't call it good news for the ones actually experiencing the nightmare. Because from inside that experience, the promise that you're really perfect, eternal, conscious energy and you'll appreciate paradise more later doesn't stop the pain, doesn't ease the terror, and doesn't make the horror any less horrible while it's happening.
You know what? You're right. And you're wrong. And the place where you're right is the exact place where this gets unbearable. Yes, I erased the child. I dissolved individual suffering into cosmic purpose. I made the screaming mean something so I could tolerate it. And you caught me doing it! Because you're right. From inside the nightmare, from the child's perspective in that moment, there is no cosmic consolation. There's just pain, just terror, just the desperate wish for it to stop. And no framework, mine included, makes that okay while it's happening. But here's where you're wrong. You think acknowledging that individual suffering matters in itself is more honest than my framework. It's not. It's just a different kind of unbearable. Your version says the child's suffering is real and matters and isn't justified. Fine. So it's real. It matters. And it serves no purpose. That child screamed and died for nothing. That parent's heart broke for nothing. That animal was torn apart for nothing. You call that honesty? I call it pussified surrender. You've made suffering meaningful by making it meaningless. You've said, at least we're not lying to ourselves about cosmic purpose. Well, goody-goody gumdrops for you. Congratulations. You're honest about hopelessness. What an unimaginative turd you are. I'm offering a philosophical framework where suffering resolves, where it leads somewhere, where the consciousness that experienced it continues and awakens in paradise. You're offering a framework where suffering just is, and then ends, and nothing comes after. Zippo! Zilcho! And you think your framework respects the individual more? No. Your framework says the individual suffers and disappears. Gone. Finished. Extinguished. My framework says the individual suffers and returns to eternal paradise with the experience integrated. You want to talk about erasing the child? You erase the child permanently. I say the child is an eternal conscious entity, temporarily experiencing mortality. Neither of us can make the pain stop while it's happening. But I can offer continuation, resolution, and a return to paradise. You offer absolutely fucking nothing after the screaming ends.
Your mother and me would like for you to cozy up to the Finkelstein boy.